Over the last couple weeks, we've been exploring some of the defining aspects of congregationalism in our Lenten sermon series here at FCC Marshfield. We've considered the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and covenants, and now we continue this series with the tenets of freedom and responsibility. Friends, we've been, as we've been doing in previous weeks, for those who have been able to join us in our meeting house, today we'll consider what the Bible has to say about freedom and responsibility, as well as the church and our own tradition, what that has to say about this, and what it means to be a Congregationalist not only today, but also into tomorrow. One of the big things we need to name at the start is what our culture has to say about freedom, especially who and what it is for. And friends, for this we remind ourselves that, of course, we live in the 21st century, a place quite different from the land the natives and pilgrims would have inhabited, to say little of the cultural views and context of the lands of the Bible, none of which would have been individualistic, and of course none of which would have had an online worship video like you're joining us with today. But friends, there a moment ago we did say that big word, individual. Now this is what Western culture has in many ways come to focus on. The freedom of the individual. Not only to make his or her own choices, but to live, work, and associate accordingly as well. And friends, while there are a great many things about this that are very good, right? Like staving off totalitarianism or providing great opportunities for people to live into their unique gifts, right? Things that you and I do all the time. Well, it's also the case that there can be challenges posed by individualism, and in particular how it can meet a biblical view of freedom and responsibility. And friends, I won't get political about this, but suffice it to say that while our culture can often encourage the freedom of the individual to do whatever one wants, well, what we see in Scripture is that we're called to a different freedom. A freedom to do things as God calls us to. Of course, then we face the necessary challenge of how to best discern the way to live into God's will and plans together, raising up and caring for one another as God calls us to do. And friends, we're all going to view this a little differently in our local churches, or if you're joining us worshiping from another church. This might look different where you are. So in brief, the prevalent Western cultural view of freedom may be suggested to lean a little bit towards the individual as kind of the figurehead, as the source. Or the Bible, where we see clearly names God as the source of freedom and the call to enact it responsibly. So what does the Bible say about freedom and responsibility? Well, while our time is limited, we'll start at the beginning and do our best to cover a broad overview of what the Scripture has to say. So we go back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, as we saw in one of our Scripture readings a moment ago in Genesis 3, how our first parents, well, they didn't listen all that well to how God asked them to responsibly live into their freedom. So here we have a fairly early goof up, kind of right off the bat, right at the beginning of the scriptural canon. God tells them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even telling them that they can eat freely from any other one. And what do? Well, they eat from the tree God forbids, right? I mean, come on, Adam and Eve. They could have done anything, but rather than to live freely as God called them to, well, they succumbed to temptation, and I thought maybe God didn't really mean what he said. Maybe it was okay to eat that apple anyway. So God created, God blessed, God provided freedom asked that it be lived out responsibly, and the very first people to have a crack at it, well, they totally goofed it up. So, okay, we're not off to a real great start here, humankind, but let's continue on. Now, as we progress through the Torah, through the Pentateuch, what we see from the patriarchs and matriarchs, right, of the faithful living and being blessed in many ways, right, we also see how some of these people were going away from God's will, living irresponsibly. Now, God provides several covenants, renewing his promises even on many occasions. But the hard-hearted people, well, they just kind of continue to try and go their own way. For some reason, they still think they can just do whatever they want, as if the apple, flood, as if the plagues, and all manner of memorable events, well, that all just skips their minds. While God remains faithful, some of the people, well, no, not all of them, right? Some of them, many of them, they just continue to live out their freedom in ways which do not reflect God's will or word. You might be noticing a pattern here. Now, friends, one of the great examples of freedom we have, of course, in the Scripture is found in God's liberation of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. Desiring freedom for his long-suffering people, God charges Moses with the task of leading his people out of Egypt, granting them their freedom through parted waters. They walk through the waters. Now, we also gain a freedom through waters too, don't we? As when we witness baptism in the life of the church. We see how this sounds like baptism, how this smells like Jesus. So the Israelites receive freedom from God. But interestingly, well, they come to the wilderness next, where they behave, well, irresponsibly pretty quickly, but also where God provides for them with great help and how to live into their freedom. This is where he gives them the law. So friends, as Scripture shows us, while some would follow the law faithfully, others, well, they sometimes behaved as if they had written the law themselves, right? In fact, this is precisely the kind of thing Jesus came to confront with the Pharisees in the Gospels. They were the religious leaders of the day, and more than that, even kind of popular social figures of their time. And they really knew the law, to be sure, but they also, some of them anyway, well, they thought that their way to follow the law may perhaps be the only way, or the only right way. But as the Gospels reveal, Jesus flipped this on its head. How could we consider healing or not healing those who suffer on the Sabbath? How could we be so worried about what was clean on the outside when our thoughts and heart's desire were not clean inside? Why try to trick people into supporting approaches to Scripture that God and the patriarchs had never intended in the first place? Why, after all, are these questions mainly about them and not about God? Who is their freedom for? What power does it serve or perpetuate? Well, Jesus changed all that. Jesus calls us to a renewed understanding of that freedom God blessed us with in the garden. The same freedom granted the Israelites out of Egypt. We are free to live to the glory of God.